Hi, Hotties. Welcome back to the Real House Guest of North Hollywood. I am your host, Carson Frey. It's book club. So our book for this month is What Remains by Carole Radziwill. So Carole is an award-winning journalist. She worked at ABC News for 15 years. She's the author of The Widow's Guide to Sex and Dating, and she was also on RHONY from 2012 to 2018. It is RHONY week. I'm recording it the weekend before RHONY comes out, so this is before we get into the celebration of the premiere, which I'm so excited RHONY's back. So, to start the episode, I'm going to give you guys a little summary of the book. And then I had a discussion with my Grammie again. We talked about, Grammie really liked this book, but it's interesting with every book with Grammie how, one, I'm learning more about my grandmother, and then I feel closer to her as well. So the whole book really, chapter one is really truly like an introduction on her grief. She really kind of lays out like, this is what's going to happen. These are the people, and this is them. They're going to die. And she kind of like reflects on the profound impact of his illness and his death. And it kind of sets it up. It's love, loss, memory. Like I think in the first chapter, it ends with, and what remains, you know? Chapter two is really her breaking down like her early memories. She's delving into her childhood, sharing her formative experience, all the things that made her who she was in childhood. I really loved her like shaping her family, you know, because she's from a very different family than the one she married into. In this chapter, she also kind of breaks down her connection to the Kennedy family and what her career in television looked like. Chapter 3, though, that's her meeting Anthony, her husband, who is probably one of the most important characters in the book. In this chapter, Carole recounts her first meeting with Anthony. She kind of illustrated their connection and how it blossomed. They actually met working on the Mendez case. You know, the show everyone's talking about right now. They worked on the real thing. Yeah. So that's how they met. And it wasn't like a, let's get married. Like it was a slow build, which I really enjoyed that part of it. And then she had this early excitement in the relationship, a lot of like girlish falling in love things. And I see Carole as such a woman. You know, she's a little bit older than my mom, maybe around her age or so. And so I was just like, oh my God, me too. Ah, I get that. You know, those very girly vibes. But then kind of quickly it moves into the diagnosis. Carole discusses the moment they learn of Anthony's cancer diagnosis. They detail the emotional and just like the uncertainty that followed with a cancer diagnosis or right after you get married. This chapter really emphasizes what challenges they face together and also kind of builds it for some challenges Carole's facing on her own as well. But then, you know, it really goes into what is navigating illness, you know. This chapter, it's really Carole reflecting on what their journey is through treatment. She shares like the strain it has on their relationship, and how they cope and like the realities of cancer. Then we kind of move into support systems. So it really focuses on what the support they were getting from their family and friends and all the kind of connections throughout the whole family, his family especially. I also think this chapter had a strong emphasis on her friendship with Carolyn and JFK Jr. You know, it really emphasized it was the four of them facing mortality. I mean, chapter 7, it really was more about Anthony and his insights and his feelings, where Anthony was at in the final days. And the book is broken up more in year 1, year 2, you know, throughout his cancer. And that's when you really get the feeling of this man is dying. This is scary. This is sad. This man is dying. Then it really kind of goes into Carole's insight of like, it gets very somber. It gets very somber because then we're in Anthony's final days. And Carole's just reflecting and reflecting and reflecting of this like impending loss. And this is all Anthony because 3 months before Anthony died is when the plane crash happened. And a lot of the book is her expecting Anthony's death. And it's going to happen. Was it going to happen? And when it gets to the point of like Anthony is really sick and he is dying, that's when the plane crash happens. And that's something Grammie and I talk about later on in the episode of expected death, unexpected death. It'll fuck anyone up, either one. And then the aftermath. So Carole just kind of explores her feelings of grief, of isolation, of how to move forward. How do you go from, a marriage, so 2, but then 1, but also within their friend group. It was 4, then goes to 1. That just, because I imagine my partner now, my best friend, their partner, and then all of a sudden everyone's gone. Yeah, that would just be really hard. But I think there's this space in Carole, and it kind of throughout the end of the book, she's looking for some type of journey of reflection in order to keep moving on, to keep moving forward, truly. And then really the emphasis is on love, loss, resilience, all the things. And Carole's like, how do I honor him, but also embrace the complexities of being a person on planet Earth? Yeah, it's such an interesting book because most of the books we're going to read for this series are people who are like trying to take what Bravo did and say, but this is what this is my point of view. This is my side of it. This was written before she was on Housewives. I'm going to end it with a quote. And I feel like this was my favorite quote in the book. I think it highlights Carole's writing, how she sees things from an objective point of view, but is still very like feeling in it. One of the myths of cancer is that it triggers bravery and heroism and larger than life qualities amplified against the bleak backdrop. But bravery can be confused with denial. A patient can deny what is happening and then go on about his business, live life to the fullest, but that is not the same as being brave. A patient's wife can sit for hours at a bedside, memorize lists of medicines, spend countless nights on a hospital cot. But that is an entirely different thing from being staunch or devoted. It is what the bewildered do, stunned in the headlights, unable to come up with anything else. Yeah. I want to thank Carole for being a storyteller. I DM'd her multiple times before this podcast throughout reading the book, just feeling like we were just casually friends. But she responded and she reposted me to her story. So Carole, if somehow you come across this, thank you. This book's important, and I would definitely recommend this book to Bravo or non-Bravo. So now for my interview with Grammie. If you are a fan of Grammie, comment wherever you're watching and listening this and just say, oh my gosh, your Grammie's so cool, your Grammie's so hot, your Grammie's so smart, your Grandma's so funny, because she is all those things. So yeah. Hi, welcome back to the Real Housecast of North Hollywood. I would like to welcome my Grammie back as my co-host because it's book club, her favorite episode of the month, my favorite episode of the month. And this month, once again, we are talking about What Remains by Carole Radziwill. Grammie, what are your overall first thoughts from reading it?
Oh, wow. I was impressed with her. I really was. I enjoyed it because there was lots of name dropping, but they were people that,
Mhm.
I was always fascinated with, the Kennedys and the Roswells and
Mhm.
all the ABC News people, Peter
Yeah.
Jennings. Those are names that I was fascinated with. So it was a fun read.
Were you familiar with who her husband was at all before the book?
I had heard of him, but I hadn't really heard much about him.
Yeah.
Not like John Kennedy Jr.
Well, and I know who her mother-in-law was because of the Truman Capote show this year, where they had all the socialites from New York, and Lee Ratzwell was like one of the major characters in it. And so when I was watching it, I was like, oh, this is like Real Housewives of New York, but in the 60s, 70s, you know? Um, which to me, I know a lot of our conversation was like, I can't imagine her on Housewives. But if you imagine her with her mother in law, and I think it's kind of that kind of housewife, like the New York socialite that she kind of becomes in a way. Um, c- Tell me though, more about that though, when you were like, I can't imagine her on Housewives. What was your impression of her relationship with reality TV? Because this book was before she was on Housewives.
That has been the hardest part for me to understand why she
Mhm.
chose to go on The Real Housewives because the only thing that I could think of, because she had this really glamorous life with being connected to the Kennedys and then royalty um,
Mhm.
and her job on ABC News, she got to travel all over the world and do some really interesting things. And so I couldn't understand. Of course, I don't watch The Real Housewives, or I
Yeah.
haven't. And so I just couldn't picture being content with being of that kind of.
Yeah.
She seems more private too
hmm
in the book.
I She did have a clause in her contract that they weren't allowed to bring up the Kennedys. And she sometimes would talk about it, but other women couldn't be like, oh, da 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 da. And I was rewatching some of her seasons, and one of the women was like, oh, I was good friends with John John. Yeah, we partied. And Carole got so mad because she was like, none of his friends called him John John. That was like a press thing. And so it's interesting because Carole just went, I'm not talking about this, kind of blink in the face.
Well, yes. And well, I would think that would be difficult not to mention them because for a while, for a number of years, they were, a big part of her life.
Yeah. And that's, I think, one thing. If you just say, like, oh, her husband was JFK's cousin, it's one thing, but they weren't just like cousins. They were best friends,
Yes.
siblings. Like, they were like truly family, family, family. Um, what do you think overall motivated Carole, though, to write this book?
I think it was to deal with grief. I mean, this poor woman, I mean, I lost my husband just a few years ago and we went through a cancer. And so I was very sympathetic to her because she was dealing with this, but I think I'd been married 60 years. She was
Mm-hmm.
only newly married and had to cope with this right away. And I just think the grief was horrendous. And
Mm-hmm.
so writing about this, I think, was a way to cope with the grief and
I
her
agree.
loss. And
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, I think when we think of widows, we think of people like you, who are in their 80s, who were
right,
married for 50 something years. But she was 29 when she got married. Like, she was my age. That's like really,
true.
really young to be experiencing certain things. Um,
Oh, I just so many things that she went through and taking care of him and coping with the whole process that I'm just amazed. I think she must be an extremely, well, she is an extremely intelligent, hardworking woman. And she threw herself into dealing with that the same way she did with dealing with her job at ABC. And
Yeah, very observant. It seems like she kind of stands in a room and kind of just observes everything, takes it in, and is just like kind of writing in her mind about it. Like when she describes her wedding, and she's like, there's this like super famous person and my uncle. And just kind of she's seeing the juxtaposition in the moment almost.
I loved her writing about the wedding. I mean, it just seemed like a magical wedding, and I enjoyed that so much with all the details.
Yeah. I looked up the photos of it. It was so pretty. And it was truly a royal wedding. Um, what things though, Grammy, like did you relate to and not relate to? Were there any things like you were like, yeah, I didn't feel that way about my husband dying, or I didn't feel that way about, were there anything specifically you were like, I didn't relate to that?
Well, part of me, I kept thinking they had so much help, all the experimental treatments and so many
Mm-hmm.
hospital stays and so forth. I didn't have that. We
No.
just pretty much were on our own. We didn't get flown to better hospitals or anything. Although I feel that we had good doctors,
Mm-hmm.
but there were a couple of things I really identified with. Is at one point she talking about not breaking down,
Mm-hmm.
because I remember that so well. I can't cry now. I have to wait until it's all over. And
Mm-hmm.
then at one point in the book, she mentions the anger,
Mm-hmm.
where, or I guess she wrote, emotions are spilling over. And
Yeah.
I can remember just John and I would get so angry with each other. And I kept telling myself, we're angry at the situation, not each other. And I felt that. And there was one scene and she wrote about in the hospital where they got mad.
Yeah. No, that felt very real about the weight it would be on a couple, and like you can't, you're mad at the cancer, but
Yes,
what but your partner's in front of you. So that's who gets your anger, I guess. And it I found that interesting too because it felt more like the reality of like what it is like, to have a partner dying and on both sides of it. And it just felt like sometimes there's like, oh, be the supportive doting wife, but sometimes you're going to be fucking mad at them and they might be mad at you. And I think one thing about you and Carole, I kind of saw, like, you two are both people who loved your husbands, but maybe you weren't put on earth to be caregivers, and that's okay, but you're put in this caregiving position.
but you're right. And I've, after talking to a lot of other people who've been caregivers, I think
Mm-hmm.
we all share some of the same feelings. And she was thrust into it so quickly. And not only that, but just after losing her best friend. I mean,
Yeah.
that was the horror of it. She was coming from a place of being so taken in loss. And then her husband dies shortly thereafter. I mean, I really feel like that had to be the most difficult thing in the world.
To go from 4 to 1, she's spending Christmas with them and everything. It's the four of them, and I think she really expected when Anthony died that she would at least have those two, you know to take care of her and be her emotional support, because she doesn't come from their world, so she's kind of an outsider. But her relationship with John and Carol Carolyn, it's like this like safe place in it where, and she, because when she goes home to her family, she's different from them now. And so it's like with them, they have this like kind of safe place in both worlds.
Well, that was it. I mean, she and Carolyn both came from similar backgrounds and then were thrust into the spotlight and had to deal with all the paparazzi and the fame and so forth. And so together they were kind of united and had a safe place to be. So I really liked their friendship and I could understand it. And
Mhm.
but then to lose her, it just was so horrible.
Yeah. No, it's completely horrible, and it's kind of we've talked about in our family what's worse, knowing someone's going to die or them being unexpectedly ripped from you. And Carol had both in a 3-month span. Like, that's insane. Like, I can't imagine that because I think my theory is both suck in different ways. It's all awful. But that having both, I can't imagine. Like, and also just what then do you do with your life if everything's ripped away at once in a way?
That's true. And I'm sure she was kind of at odds after it all happened. And
I know.
even though writing the book helped, that's still her life is forever changed.
Yeah. And she hasn't married again. Like, she has like boyfriends, but nothing like she won't get married. And I don't think she will get married again. Um were there any instances you felt like Carol wasn't completely truthful, or do you feel like she was vulnerable throughout the whole book?
I felt that she was pretty truthful. I didn't have any sense of, oh, come on, this didn't happen, or that it maybe wasn't quite the same.
Mhm.
Uh, I felt she was pretty good at expressing what was happening.
Mhm. I did too. I felt like this was a unique Bravo book in the sense of because she wasn't on Bravo, probably, she had no image to portray. She was just like, this is my story. And so I think it's kind of a unique book in that way of compared to the other things we'll be reading where people are like, hey, I have to set the record straight. She's more like, this is it.
Well,
um,
just the fact she talked about her grandmother Millie, who would steal from the grocery store and grow pot. I mean, it just seemed to me, you're right, she laid it all out there.
I loved hearing how her childhood was because it was so vastly different than Anthony's. And I loved like just how like these two people, it really is just like, wow, any people can meet and fall in love, you know? It's cool. And it was a thing on Housewives that everyone would be like, oh, Carol's a princess, Carol's a princess. And she wouldn't say anything, you know? And it's like, but you are a princess, technically. What do you think her biggest strength is, like throughout the book?
I think her work ethic. I mean, she was a hard worker. And just the fact that she went, rose through the ranks at ABC showed that she was willing to put in the extra work, and plus her ability to pay attention to detail. It seemed
Mm-hmm.
like she was a very detail-minded person, which served her well at ABC.
Oh,
But
yeah.
I was really impressed how hard she worked.
I think it's not an easy thing to go from an internship to being an on air talent. And, I think she was there 14 years in total. That's like not a ton of time to go from internship to like on air reporter. Like, that's pretty cool. Um, and I do think that's something that made her stand out on Housewives a lot, Grammie, because during the 2016 election, Carol was still on the show.
Oh,
Those women, yeah, those women on there, everyone except for her and one other were all Republicans. And they were like women who were Upper East Side friends with Trump, who actually, Carol would say they didn't know anything about politics. And so they would fight with her constantly.
oh
And
my
that's,
gosh.
yeah, yeah. So you can imagine how it felt with her. She's fighting with these buffoons who don't know anything. And then she was wrong. Like, he did win, and like how that felt for her because she
Oh,
knows
yes.
like, yeah. Do you think though Portia and Carol share any similarities?
In a way, they do. They both have, uh, as a part of their life, had famous people. I mean,
Mhm.
Portia's um, grandfather was
Yeah.
Martin Luther King's right-hand man. So they've had, and then of course Carol married into the the publicity and the fame, but
Mm-hmm.
they've both had some experience with it. Neither
Mm-hmm.
one of them were just strictly small town girls who didn't know anyone famous. That although I think Portia was more of a, well, they were both young, but Portia was more of
Mm-hmm.
a playgirl, I guess I'd want to say.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think, though, both of them share this thing. And this is not really from the book, it's more from them on the shows as I know them, where at the end, so where we know them kind of now, they're both insanely independent, which I think is cool because both of their books are kind of centered around men. And then to go from centering your life around a man, whether he's awful in Portia's case or not terrible in Carole's case, but then to be able to center your own life, you know?
That is true. They both are strong women. And I think that's
Mhm.
why I enjoyed both books and I liked them.
They're different though, and Carol's a unique housewife because she hasn't remarried since Anthony, and she one of the few women on the show that doesn't have children. Um, and I think too, a lot of the times on the shows, we see these women being terrible and awful and throwing wine glasses at each other. But then we see them at home with their kids and they're like really good moms. So as an audience, you're like, how bad are they? Carol didn't get that benefit on the show. You know, we saw her at home with her cats. And I think she still didn't have to fight for that like from the audience. Like there are certain women who are divorced and the children's father doesn't let the kid film, and you can feel that like people are less empathetic. And I think it's because of Carol's so smart though.
Yes. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, the difference it would make.
Yeah. Well, Grammy, are you about ready for your martini rating?
Yes, I got my
Okay.
martini, and
So
on a scale
how
of
many?
1 to 5, I'm going to award this book 4 olives to go in my martini.
Woo!
It was great. I loved the
I
writing, and I was fascinated with the characters. It was a
Yeah.
great book. Thanks for asking me to read it.
No, I think it's fun. And I think it's fun how every time we read a book, like I relate to Carol in certain ways, and you relate to Carol, and then we relate to Portia, and then like, but we're all from different generations and all these different worlds. And it's just like, oh, but we're all women. And some of those things are just part of like our what, experience on planet Earth as women.
Exactly. And I enjoy reading about women.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we go, we do want to announce our book club for next month. I have it right here. You Can't Have It All by Stassi Schroeder. It just came out. Grammie, I'm so excited to read this with you. Stassi's one of
Oh, I
my
can't wait.
She is my girl. I love her. I listen to her podcast. She was on Vanderpump Rules, which is a spinoff of Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. And essentially, one of the housewives owned a bunch of restaurants in LA. They took one restaurant and realized this group of friends were all sleeping with each other and fighting and best friends and all wanted to be famous. And so they made a show, but Stassi was the star. She is the
Oh,
star.
okay.
She is Her most favorite line is, I don't know why I did to you, but I'll take a Pinot Grigio.
I like that. A girl after my
Yeah.
own heart.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see how many olives she gets. Um, yeah. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe us on all platforms and comment saying you love Grammy.
Thanks, Carson.